Amid the roaring laughter of the guests, a man in a white suit stepped onto the stage, raised his glass of wine, and said in a voice cold as steel, "Solve this right here, right now, and I'll give you $500 million. The hall fell silent for one heartbeat, then erupted in laughter, because the person he was talking to was just a black janitor kneeling on the floor with a mop in her hand. But instead of backing away, she stood up. Her eyes met the billionaire's, and in a calm, almost whispering voice, she said, "I accept." The air froze. The wine glass in his hand trembled. The laughter faded, as if the whole room had forgotten how to breathe. She didn't run. She didn't resist. But 10 minutes later, he would wish he had never opened his mouth. Solve it, and 500 janitor's is yours. When humiliation meets genius, only one walks away whole. If you believe justice doesn't need to scream to be heard, hit like, share, and leave a comment for her. The clinking of crystal glasses echoed like the opening note of a grand gala. Golden light reflected off marble columns, slid across tables draped in white linen, and came to rest on the man standing at the center of the stage, Sakayama Masahiro, Japanese tech billionaire, his face cold, his gaze sharp as a blade. He lifted his wine glass, his deep voice cutting through the air, each word precise and heavy. "Solve this equation right here, right now, and I'll give you $500 million. The crowd held its breath, then burst into laughter, not because they believed him, but because they thought it was a joke. Laughter rippled outward like waves. But Masahiro didn't laugh. His eyes didn't turn toward the rows of professors, nor were the seats filled with powerful investors. They stopped on a black woman kneeling on the marble floor, polishing it to a mirror shine. A waiter leaned toward his friend and whispered, "Is he talking to the janitor?" Masahiro smirked. "You clean this floor every day, so why not try cleaning up my equation while you're at it?" Laughter erupted again, louder, crueler. The woman paused. The mop slipped from her calloused hand and fell softly to the floor. She rose to her feet. Thin frame, silver gray uniform, her eyes locked on the billionaire's. Unflinching, her voice was calm, neither loud nor trembling. "I accept." For a heartbeat, the entire hall stopped breathing. The wine glass froze midair. The laughter caught in throats. Every gaze turned toward her, the woman who had just turned humiliation into a challenge. A strange, heavy silence fell. Then, somewhere in the crowd, someone whispered, "Did she mean it?" And in that moment, the story that would shake the world began. The silence lasted only a few seconds, but it was enough to change the atmosphere. No longer a gala, but a stage of power. The chandelier light spilled across the marble floor, shimmering faintly. Every gaze, every breath seemed to carry weight. Masahiro tilted his head slightly, his eyes sliced through the air like a blade of ice. A faint smirk formed on his lips, not of amusement, but of intrigue toward someone bold enough to cross the line. He stepped down from the glass platform. Each tap of his shoes struck the marble, sharp, metallic, deliberate. "Did you just say you accept?" His voice was low, each word dropping like glass marbles onto stone. The woman nodded. No trembling, no justification. The light hit her face. Beads of sweat glimmered on her forehead like dew. And in her eyes, not recklessness, but the calm, unshakable awareness of dignity. Whispers rippled through the hall. A man in a tuxedo adjusted his glasses and sneered, "God, does she think this is some kind of riddle?" A woman in an emerald gown replied softly. Her tone was like salt pressed into a wound. "Let's see how long before she embarrasses herself." Laughter spread again, thin and smoky. Phones lifted, lenses opened, flashes blinked, a perfect viral bait for the crowd. The janitor, now reduced to a spectacle. At the far corner, Professor William Carter, silver-haired, eyes solemn. He remained silent. He knew this game well. Power loves to humiliate the powerless, to remind itself who rules. Beside him, Chancellor Howard Green glanced around nervously. He understood. One wrong step, and the university could become the stage for a donor's arrogance. Masahiro turned to the audience, his voice is theatrical, booming. "Ladies and gentlemen, witness what has never happened in human history. A janitor, A woman who cleans floors will now attempt to clean up my mathematics." The hall burst into laughter. Scattered applause followed, hollow and forced. Masahiro took another sip of wine, his lips curving into a cold, precise line. He saw no opponent, only entertainment. But in that moment, something subtle shifted. The woman no longer bowed her head. She was no longer the cleaning lady. The light reflecting off her silver-gray uniform made it look almost like armor. She placed the mop aside, straightened her back, and let her arms hang freely, not trembling, but deliberate. "You made your promise before everyone," she said softly. $500 million. Another silence fell, thicker this time, not because they believed her, but because they began to fear that she did. And as the cameras kept rolling, mocking eyes began to waver. Among that sea of diamonds and power, a small crack appeared, the first fracture in the fortress of arrogance that Sakayama Masahiro believed he ruled from its peak. In the shadows, Professor Carter exhaled quietly, almost to himself. Never underestimate silence. Sometimes it's the first step of a storm. A faint breeze slipped through the towering glass windows, stirring the white curtains behind the orchestra. For a moment, the laughter, the clinking glasses, the whispers, all blended into one hollow sound. The woman, Marion Johnson, drew a slow, steady breath. It wasn't the breath of fear, but of someone about to cross a line that could never be uncrossed. She lifted her head. Then, "Let's begin." 4 small words, quiet, yet they dropped like a single raindrop on still water, sending ripples through every soul in the room. The crowd fell silent. Masahiro raised an eyebrow, then smiled. "How fascinating," he said, his voice like a razor gliding over glass. A janitor attempting to solve the equation that even the Japanese Institute of Mathematics couldn't touch. "Be my guest." He stepped back, eyes dark and deep, watching his prey. Marion walked toward the massive digital board, nearly 8 meters tall, covered in tangled symbols and glowing formulas. The blue light reflected across her face, illuminating the thin sheen of sweat at her temple. She didn't look at the crowd. She didn't look at the billionaire. She only looked at the glowing equations before her, as if seeing a familiar language buried under years of dust. To most in the hall, the symbols were nothing but chaos, a meaningless labyrinth. But to her, they were melodies. Old melodies she once knew by heart when she was still Dr. Marion Johnson, the youngest faculty member in the Department of Applied Mathematics at Boston University. Those symbols once meant passion, the late nights in a lit office, and her husband David taking her hand and saying, "Mathematics is the language of faith, Marion. You just have to believe that every chaos hides a pattern." Then David died, and the world went silent. In the nights that followed, she sat by a small wooden desk under a flickering yellow lamp, her young son asleep beside her, and she kept writing. Not for money, not for recognition, but if she stopped, she would disappear. She had once belonged here, where blackboards met white chalk, where sharp minds argued over proofs and theories. Then one day, she was replaced by faces younger, brighter, and academia had no room for a poor black widow. From the lecture hall, she moved to the hallway, from professor to janitor, and now, in this very university where she once wiped chalk dust off the board, she stood before another, larger, brighter, while everyone who once laughed now had to watch. A cold gust passed through. Marion set her mop down in the corner. Her calloused hands brushed together once, then rested on the glowing control panel. Her eyes no longer wavered. Only stillness remained. The stillness of someone who has lost everything, and therefore fears nothing. Masahiro folded his arms and gave a curt nod. "Go ahead, the stage is yours." Marion met his gaze, and in that look, something shifted. The air grew colder by half a degree. A storm had begun, not with thunder, but with silence. The giant screen glowed in a cold blue light. There stood Marion, motionless, quietly studying the maze of symbols sprawling before her like an endless wall. But in her eyes, there was no fear, only the light of memory returning. The scene shifted, like a film reel spinning backward through time. Chalk dust floated in the air. The rhythmic tap of chalk on the board echoed in a bright lecture hall. Years ago, Dr. Marion Johnson, young, hair tied high, lectured passionately about hidden structures within prime numbers. Her voice was clear, confident, alive with belief. "You know," she said, smiling, "every chaos has a shape. We just haven't learned to wait long enough to see it." A student raised his hand. "But how do we find that shape, Professor?" She wrote 3 words on the board. "See the shape. Not with your eyes," she said softly, "but with your mind." That light-filled lecture hall where she once lived was once called a prodigy, had long since gone dark. When her husband David fell ill, everything began to collapse. The hiss of ventilators, the weight of hospital bills, the shrinking paychecks, the termination notices. One afternoon, she held a rejection letter in her trembling hands. "We regret to inform you." Her tears fell onto the signature line. The nameplate reads, "Dr. Marion Johnson, Associate Professor," was taken down. She never stood at that lectern again. The reel fast forwards. Evenings in a small apartment, she wiped the table, boiled water, and taught her young son math. "Mom," he once asked, "why don't you teach anymore?" She said nothing, just stroked his hair and whispered, "Because sometimes people don't want to see what doesn't fit their frame." Cut to late night. The only light, a yellow lamp over a kitchen table. She sat alone, pencil in hand, writing on the backs of unpaid bills. Equations, symbols, circles, hexagons, the fragments of the world she once belonged to. The pencil scratched softly, then stopped. She smiled wearily. Beside the paper lay an old photograph. Her grandfather, Isaiah Brown, kind face and deep, knowing eyes. Memory turned another page. A southern summer. A young black girl sat on a weathered wooden porch in front of an old man with a short, stubby pencil. Isaiah drew on the paper, interlocking hexagons, then a single circle around them. "See this, Marion?" he said gently. "Every fortress has a door. You just have to know where it is." "But what if there isn't one, Grandpa?" He smiled, his eyes glinting behind thick lenses. "Then you make one." That sentence became the lifeblood running quietly through her years. And though she didn't know when, she always knew it would awaken someday. And now, in this glittering hall, it was awakening for real. She closed her eyes. Her grandfather's image appeared clearly. The dusty room, the dark wooden desk, wartime cipher sheets, rows of secret codes. He had been a Pentagon cryptographer, a man who knew that within every chaos there hides an invisible order. And he had taught her how to see it, how to turn mathematics into the geometry of intuition. She remembered one rainy night, his hand was resting on a page full of symbols. "Marion," he said, "every problem is a fortress, but don't attack it. Find the door." When he died, she kept only a bundle of old papers, sketches of hexagons, circles, and a scrawled line. Every fortress has a door. She carried them in a small wooden box for years. Through cheap apartments, through the halls she mopped every night, through the buildings where they only called her janitor. And now, standing before Sakayama Masahiro's towering wall of numbers, she finally saw those shapes again. They had never left her, only slept, waiting for this moment. Down in the audience, Professor Carter watched Marion, a flicker of awe in his eyes. Something in the way she stood told him he was witnessing something unprecedented, a mind long buried, rising back from the dark. The hum of the ventilation system filled the silence. The screen still glowed. Masahiro raised his glass, eyes narrowing, his voice low. "Are you ready?" Marion opened her eyes, her fingers intertwined. A single steady breath. "It's time," she whispered, "to open the door." And as the stylus touched the screen, a flash of light burst forth, like a tiny bolt of lightning. From that moment on, the past would never sleep again. The first sound was a click, the stylus tip touching glass. A tiny point of light appeared at the center of the blue screen, lonely as a star in a dark sky. Marion drew a quiet breath. Her arm traced a curve, then stopped. A perfect hexagon appeared, each edge aligned. as if measured by a diamond blade. The crowd held its breath for a few seconds, then burst into laughter. "What is this, kindergarten?" One man scoffed, his wine glass trembling slightly in his hand. "Maybe she's teaching us how to draw a beehive." Laughter spread, bright, cruel, triumphant. Marion didn't answer. Her hand kept moving. The first hexagon linked to a second, then a third. Layer upon layer unfolded, like petals of a geometric flower. She drew intersecting circles, each intersection falling precisely at the center of the previous shape. So precise, the projector auto-adjusted its brightness to keep up. Professor Carter leaned forward, the skin on his arms prickling, not because it was beautiful, but because it was deliberate. There was no hesitation in her strokes, no searching, no guesswork. Each line, swift, confident, exact, carried the rhythm of someone fluent in this language. Masahiro arched a brow, voice dripping with mockery. "Art, is it? Or are you trying to summon the ghost of mathematics past?" Laughter again, but this time it faltered quickly. Marion stopped. She stepped back, studying the cluster of interlocked circles and hexagons. Then, for the first time, she began writing equations at each intersection. Arithmetic, algebra, trigonometry, all weaving together like music. Her hand moved fast, almost faster than thought, each symbol born from a geometric point, as if the universe itself were expanding from the first spark. Professor Carter's voice slipped out, barely above a whisper. No, it's not random. She's mapping functions onto geometric axes." Dr. Green, the chancellor, frowned. "She's what?" "She's translating the equation from algebraic to geometric space," Carter murmured, his eyes widening. "She's not solving it. She's translating its language." Awe and fear trembled in his voice. Marion continued. The blue light washed over her face, making her seem almost unreal. She spoke softly, as if to herself. "You look for formulas, I look for shape." At the back row, a young reporter raised her phone to record. The lens trembled, not from her hand, but from the air itself, charged with something no one could name. Those who had laughed now sat silent. They didn't understand, but they felt the precision, the eerie rightness of each motion, as though every stroke of her pen plucked an invisible string in their minds. Marion turned, touched the stylus to a central point. A spiral of symbols appeared. Then she spoke. "Mr. Sakiyama once called it an impregnable fortress." She looked up. "But every fortress has a door. The problem is, you haven't seen it." The words struck the room like thunder. Hundreds of eyes fixed on her. Masahiro's smile vanished, his gaze cold as steel. "What did you just say?" "Every fortress," she repeated calmly, "has a door." For the first time that night, no one knew how to react. On the screen, the hexagons and circles began to rotate slowly. The projector auto-rendered a 3D model. Every curve led to a numerical series. Every intersection corresponded to an equation. The once impenetrable cluster of symbols, unsolved for 20 years, was now revealing a perfect symmetrical structure. Professor Carter rose to his feet, voice trembling. "That's geometric compression. She's doing what Tanatech's supercomputer couldn't complete in a year." The audience erupted in murmurs. Donors leaned forward. An elderly man whispered, "She's not pretending. She's actually opening it." Marion stayed silent. She linked the shapes, then added 3 symbols, and one of her own invention, shaped like an open door. Then she said quietly, her voice caught by the mic, "You use power to build walls. I use memory to find doors." Silence. Absolute. Masahiro gave a thin, forced smile. He clapped slowly. Mock applause echoing through the hall. "Impressive show, but you're painting, not proving." Marion met his eyes. "You're right, but sometimes proof begins with a curve, not a number." A sharp inhale rippled through the audience. For a few seconds, the only sound was the stylus gliding across glass, steady, deliberate, alive. Each stroke drew the breath of the entire hall lower and lower. When she stopped, the screen had transformed into a vast lattice, a self-rotating geometry, light converging at its center, where a new, simplified chain of symbols appeared. The once impossible equation now looked clearer, logical, even beautiful. Professor Carter whispered, almost in disbelief. She's bending the equation into geometry, finding the rule through form. She's inside the fortress. Masahiro's grip tightened on his wine glass. A drop of red spilled onto the marble, spreading like blood. Marion didn't notice. She only saw the perfect lines unfolding beneath her hand. And in her mind, her grandfather's voice echoed, crystal clear, "When everyone sees a wall, Marion, you look for the door." She set the stylus down. The blue light bathed her face, still as a statue. Outside, the wind brushed the glass windows, rustling the branches, a faint sound like applause from afar. The first storm had begun. No one in that room yet knew that what they had just witnessed would not only rewrite the history of mathematics, but redefine the very limits of the human mind. At first, the laughter was still there, scattered, faint, hanging in the air like slow-falling shards of glass. But one by one, the sounds fractured, then dissolved into silence. No one could tell exactly when the air in the hall had changed. They only knew that somehow, the woman in the gray uniform had made more than 300 people sit still, not out of fear, but because they had begun to want to understand. The symbols on the screen no longer looked chaotic. They had rhythm. They had order. They had beauty. The hexagons intertwined like living neural networks, each intersection pulsing like an electric signal. Light swept across them, and the whole wall of data seemed to breathe. Professor Carter, a man who had spent his entire life chasing number theory, leaned forward, eyes locked on the cascading transformations. "My God," he murmured, "she's creating inverse symmetry." "Inverse," whispered Dr. Green. "Yes. Instead of moving from formula to graph, she's doing the opposite. She's reading mathematics through imagery. This isn't in any textbook." A wealthy patron behind them braced himself on the seat in front, trying to see. "She actually knows what she's doing." Others nodded silently. The laughter was gone. Only the faint, smooth sound of the stylus brushing glass remained, like a brush gliding across silk. Masahiro still stood on the stage, chin tilted, trying to hold his arrogant smile. But his eyes had begun to shift. He looked around and realized the worst thing of all. The crowd was no longer with him. Marion kept writing, kept drawing, each motion calm and precise, the rhythm of meditation. On the screen, a glowing sequence unfolded. Old mathematical symbols rotated, merged, and curved into a single flowing line, like the DNA of the universe. Professor Carter's voice rose again, clear now, a declaration. "She's doing the impossible, linking algebra, trigonometry, and geometry in one spatial rhythm." Whispers spread. "Is that true?" "No way." "But look, it aligns." Every step. Marion paused. She turned her wrist slightly, her gaze fixed on the screen, and said softly, just loud enough for the microphone to catch, "You laughed once, but in mathematics, laughter or contempt doesn't change the truth." Silence. Then she drew the final line, connecting two spirals together. As the luminous curve closed, the screen flashed, and a short formula appeared at the center, like a newly beating heart. The hall lights flickered. The system automatically magnified the result zone. In the corner, the university's AI interface displayed. Logical consistency detected, 98.7% correlation. The entire hall erupted. Chairs scraped the floor. Hands flew to mouths. A few people clapped, at first by instinct, then louder, then all at once. The first applause came from the middle row. A young intern from the tech crew whispering, "She's right." Masahiro swallowed hard. He could hear every clap, feel every gaze peeling away from him, turning toward her. He had hosted this gala to display his power. But power was slipping through his fingers, second by second, glance by glance. Marion looked around the hall, her voice calm, resonant, as if speaking to the universe itself. "You ask where my faith comes from. I don't believe in miracles. I believe in the structure hidden inside chaos. And tonight, chaos has begun to speak." The room froze. No one laughed. No one moved. From the back of the hall, a journalist whispered to her colleague, "This isn't a performance anymore. This is history." The applause still thundered like waves. But on the stage, Sakiyama Masahiro did not move. Light reflected off his face, pale, tight, his lips pressed into a razor-thin line. The crowd was still glowing with excitement, but anyone observant could sense it. A different storm was forming. Masahiro stepped forward slowly, placed his wine glass on the table. Clink! A dry, brittle sound. He smiled. The same smile people once mistook for power, now just the strained mask of a man losing control. "Magnificent," he said, voice low and icy. "A brilliant performance, a sophisticated illusion." The noise in the hall began to fade. Marion stood still, stylus in hand, the glow of the screen reflecting in her calm eyes, waiting. Masahiro took another step, turned to face the audience. "Ladies and gentlemen, don't be deceived," he said, voice rising. "She's no genius. She's a thief." A collective gasp. People turned, whispering, searching for faces to read. Professor Carter frowned. "What did you just say?" Masahiro didn't blink. "I've seen those shapes before. Those symbols. They're not hers. They exist in the classified archives owned by Tanitech, my company. Designs extracted from Cold War intelligence files. And now she dares present them here as if they were her own." Murmurs swelled. Some gasped. Others, investors, began scribbling notes. The smell of panic crept into the room. But in the front row, Dr. Carter and Dr. Green exchanged a glance, their eyes sharp, not with belief, but with realization. Masahiro had just said something he shouldn't have. Carter rose, voice gravelly but firm. "Excuse me, did you just say these geometric forms came from classified Cold War research?" Masahiro hesitated, realizing too late what he'd revealed, but tried to recover. "Yes, top-secret documents, accessible only to people like me. There's no way she could have known about them." This time, the entire hall fell silent. Eyes turned, not toward Marion, but toward him. The silence was heavy, like guilt being exposed. Marion drew a slow breath. She didn't rush to answer. She simply turned toward him, her gaze soft but cutting like a blade. "You say those documents belong exclusively to Tanitech, drawings from the Cold War archives. Then that means the project you've claimed as your own research was built on stolen government property." Gasps erupted. Reporters raised cameras. A wave of murmurs rippled across the hall. Masahiro slammed his palm against the table. "Silence! You don't understand anything!" But the louder he shouted, the thinner his voice became. The icy composure of the billionaire was shattering like glass. Professor Carter stepped forward, voice dropping, slow, cold, precise. "Mr. Sakiyama, I worked on a government analysis group in the 1980s. I recognize the symbols she drew. They belong to Isaiah Brown, an African-American cryptographer who contributed to the Pentagon's pattern geometry project. So tell me, how did your company come to possess his work?" A collective gasp swept through the room. Camera shutters snapped. Masahiro staggered back, words dying in his throat. Marion stepped forward, her voice steady, not loud, but echoing through every microphone in the hall. "Isaiah Brown was my grandfather, and everything he drew, I learned before I could even spell my name." The words hit like a hammer. No whispers, no chair creaks, only Masahiro, frozen in place. "You didn't steal my idea, Mr. Sakiyama," she said quietly. "You stole the legacy of a dead man." The hall erupted. Some stood shouting, "Oh my God!" Others began filming. Reporters rushed out to call their desks. Masahiro flung his arm, his voice breaking apart. "Lies! All lies! You can't prove any of this." But at that moment, the university's AI projection refreshed. Metadata from the Nakamura conjecture file appeared on screen. Origin 1962, U.S. Department of Defense, Pattern Geometry Project. The final nail. Flashbulbs exploded across the hall. Masahiro stood frozen, mouth open, eyes blank. And Marion only smiled faintly, as if she had finally walked the last mile of her long road. "You wanted to call me a thief." "No, Mr. Sakiyama, you just confessed the opposite." Professor Carter nodded once, Dr. Green turned to the press row. "Record everything. Tonight we've witnessed not just a problem being solved, but a confession forced into the light." Outside the hall, the night wind began to rise, and inside the glittering room, an empire of power began to crack. Each sound, each glance, each piece of evidence tilting toward the woman who once held a mop. The noise in the hall had not yet settled when Marion turned back to the screen. No wasted words, no wasted motion. She set the stylus against the glass once more. Her voice was calm, low, almost like wind. "You want proof? Then watch." The words fell like a command. The entire hall went still. Live stream cameras autofocused. Flashes stopped. Every breath waited. On the screen, new lines appeared. No longer scattered geometry, but a symphony of reason and memory. Her movements were terrifyingly precise. A circle, a cut, two symbols joined by a transformation. Then, with one more tap, a shape opened like a hidden door in a maze. The crowd held its breath. The soft clicks of the stylus meeting glass merged with faint exhalations, the rhythm of truth being written. From the front row, Professor Carter suddenly stood up. "She's not rewriting the problem," he said, voice trembling with awe. "She's translating it, recoding the entire structure through geometry." Those who had laughed now leaned forward. Hands that once held wine glasses now clenched unconsciously. With each connection Marion drew, dry formulas seemed to come alive, like a symphony performed in light. She never looked down. The symbols poured from her as if they'd always lived inside her. Somewhere in the hall, a young student whispered, "She's not solving it. She's seeing it." Masahiro still stood frozen, face rigid, eyes clouded with panic. Every stroke she drew sliced deeper into the tower of power he'd spent a lifetime building. Then, in the middle of her sequence, Marion stopped. She took a breath and erased half the screen, leaving only the fragments she needed. No one understood why. Whispers rippled. "What is she doing?" But she didn't answer. She started again, reordering everything. 1, 2, 3 spirals. Then she separated them, weaving the chaos into a 6-petal flower of perfect symmetry. Each connecting line was thin, decisive, like stitches closing an old wound. Above, the AI display annotated automatically. "Inverse symmetry mapping detected." Carter's voice broke into a whisper. Eyes wet. "She's found it. My God, she's found the door." No laughter now. No phones raised. Only a hall bathed in pale blue light and the soft sound of Marion's stylus gliding across glass. She wrote 3 more lines, then stopped. Time seemed to freeze. Everyone could hear their own heartbeat. Marion looked up. "This," she said softly, "is the part they never understood. Their mistake was trying to conquer it, but this equation was never a wall to climb. It was a door to open. And I've only done the simplest thing my grandfather taught me, to find the shape of truth." She lowered the pen. A final stroke, small, gentle. And as it touched the figure, the entire screen erupted in light. The equations shifted, realigning themselves into a single complete formula. In the top right corner, text appeared. Solution verified. Complexity reduced. 99.87%. The hall exploded. Not with shouting, but with stunned, breathless awe. Some professors clutched their heads. Others cried openly. And Carter, who had taught mathematics all his life, stood still, tears running down his face. Marion stepped back, wiping the sweat from her forehead. She looked at the center of the screen, where the final symbols continued to rotate softly, as if the equation itself were breathing. She raised the stylus once more and wrote 3 small, simple letters. QED, quad rat demonstrandum. That which was to be proven has been proven. A wave of sound broke loose. Applause, cheers, sobs, crashing against the 30-meter-high glass walls. The hall trembled under the weight of thousands of hands clapping at once. But amid the storm, Marion stood still, both hands resting lightly on the console, her eyes calm. The blue light from the screen surrounded her, forming a faint halo around her neatly tied black hair. Someone whispered, She doesn't look like she's in a battle anymore. She looks like she's standing in a ceremony. Masahiro had nowhere left to hide. The entire world was watching him. The hall, the cameras, millions online, witnessing the moment his empire crumbled under a single quiet sentence. "I've done my part. Now it's your turn to keep your promise." No one spoke. Then a single clap from Carter. Then another and another, until the entire hall rose again in thunderous applause. Masahiro bowed his head, not in respect, but in defeat. And Marion, she simply smiled gently, like someone who had just returned truth to its rightful place. The light dimmed. On the screen, the final words appeared, glowing softly against the deep blue. "Every fortress has a door. And tonight, she found it." The applause had not yet faded when the entire hall suddenly fell silent, not because anyone signaled it, but because every pair of eyes turned toward Sakayama Masahiro, the man who had just dug the pit beneath his own feet. He still stood there, shoulders trembling, the wine glass in his hand half spilled onto the marble floor. The white spotlight struck him directly, revealing a face drained of color, cracked lips, and the hollow eyes of a man who had just realized his power no longer mattered. Marion said nothing. She simply stood there, calm, unshaken. The blue glow from the screen draped over her shoulders like a robe of justice. Dr. Carter was the first to break the silence. His voice rang out, firm, resonant, undeniable. "Mr. Sakayama, before hundreds of witnesses, you said, 'Solve this problem and I will pay $500 million. And now, that promise has been fulfilled." The crowd began to nod. A few rose to their feet. Dozens of live stream cameras turned toward Sakayama. He tried to smile, but it twisted pitifully. He took a small step back, his voice faltering. This can't be. I mean, it was just a joke." Carter cut him off, not in anger, but in composure. "No, Mr. Masahiro, a promise made in public is no longer a joke. It's a matter of honor. And honor, for a man who calls himself a symbol of Japanese enterprise, is the last thing you should lose." Applause erupted again, louder, longer, like a verdict being read. Dr. Green stepped forward, holding up his phone toward the live broadcast cameras. "Wallace University will personally oversee and ensure that this payment is carried out in full, not out of greed, but as justice for someone who was once dismissed." Marion did not move. Her gaze wasn't on Masahiro. It was distant, soft, as if looking toward her grandfather and late husband standing quietly in memory. A single tear fell, not of sorrow, but release. Amid the applause, a warm, steady voice rose from the back of the hall. "She deserves more than that." The crowd turned. From the shadows stepped a middle-aged man in a simple black suit, Richard Evans, chairman of Sky Nova Aerospace and one of the university's largest benefactors. He walked slowly down the aisle, the lights glinting off his silver hair. "I've seen many brilliant minds in my life," he said, "but never someone who could stand in the face of power, humiliated, and still remain calm, precise, and true. Ms. Marion Johnson, you haven't just solved a problem. You've solved the equation of dignity." The hall went utterly still. Richard stopped before her and extended his hand. "The Sky Nova Research Fund is prepared to fully sponsor any project you wish to pursue. No limits, no conditions. We have only one request. Teach the world how to see the door within the wall." Marion hesitated briefly, looked at his hand, then smiled and clasped it gently. "Thank you," she said softly, "but I have one small condition. Make sure those doors stay open for the people cleaning the floors outside." The hall exploded. Applause, cheers, tears. No more lines between professors, executives, or janitors. Only human beings witnessing the moment justice returned. Masahiro bowed his head quietly and turned away. No one stopped him, but in that instant everyone understood. He had lost far more than money. He had lost the right to hold his head high in the very world he built. Marion stood bathed in the soft, warm light, gazing up at the screen, where the letters QED still glowed. She whispered, not to the room, but to herself, "Grandpa, we've opened the door." Night fell over the campus of Wallace University like a velvet curtain. Golden lamps lined the misted stone path, their light glimmering on the wet ground, reflecting the silhouette of a woman in a gray uniform, walking slowly, hands loose at her sides, as if she had finally set down the weight of an entire lifetime. Behind her, the echoes from the grand hall still lingered. The applause, the cheers, the reporters calling her name. But Marion did not turn back. She needed silence. After years of being forced to bow her head, she wanted, for once, to breathe her own air. She stopped beside the row of old oak trees near the back gate. A gentle breeze passed, carrying the scent of damp grass and river wind. She looked up at the sky. No bright lights now, only stars, quiet and sharp against the dark. In that moment, she understood. Freedom was not money, nor fame. It was being able to look life in the eye without fear. She smiled faintly, took out her phone, and looked at the photo of her son, Eric, sleeping peacefully in their small apartment across the city. She typed a short message. "It's done, my boy. Everything's going to be okay." Marion turned off the screen, slipped the phone back into her pocket, and kept walking. Her shadow stretched long across the stone path, melting into the night, calm, light, and truly free. The next morning, newspapers spread across cafe counters everywhere, blazing with the same headline: Black Maid solves 500 dishonest conjecture, forces billionaire to pay. The story swept across the world, from New York to Tokyo. People looked into the eyes of that woman and saw not just brilliance, but dignity reborn. In a small apartment on the west side of the city, Eric clutched the newspaper and ran to his mother, his eyes shining. Marion only smiled, quietly pouring a cup of tea. Outside the window, the morning sunlight poured over the rooftops, gentle like the beginning of a new era. At the end of the video, a line appeared on the screen: "Never measure a soul by title or wealth. Respect those around you, for greatness hides in plain sight." If this story moved you, like, share, and leave your thoughts below. And don't forget to subscribe for more stories where the quietest voices speak the loudest truths.